It was, without question, the most unexpected and shocking election night in American history. All the smart people were convinced the United States was about to get its first ever female president. Even Donald Trump thought he was going to lose. Not quite how it turned out. In hindsight, the signs of a massive upset were there to be seen, and they're chronicled in a new book called Shattered: Inside Hillary Clinton's Doomed Campaign. And co-author Amie Parnes joins us now from the American Capitol with the inside scoop. Amie, it's good to have you on again. We had you and your co-author Jonathan Allen on a few years ago on your last book about Mrs. Clinton, HRC, so we're glad you can make some time for this time. How you doing?
Good, thank you. How are you, Steve?
Super, thank you very much. Not at all. I assume, let's start here. I assume you wanted to write about Secretary Clinton's run for the presidency because you assumed that she was going to win and you wanted that front row seat on history in the making, yes?
Right. Well, we thought that she was going to win, I think, going into election night and throughout the book, really. And yes, I think we wanted to document the first female president. And our last book asked questions like, what would she learn from her 2008 run? How would that be applied to this particular campaign? And so I think it was a very obvious choice for us to want to do this and to want to answer those questions and see how she did.
Let me ask you about one of the first obvious choices that the Clinton campaign had to make, and that was, we remember well in 2008, she really didn't highlight the fact that she could have become the first ever major party female candidate for president. How did they resolve that debate this time on how hard to play, quote unquote, the female card?
I think they did a 180. I think that was a lesson they learned last time, that they should really embrace it, that they should embrace the historic nature of it. And so you saw her talk about it a lot on the trail, about what it meant for women and for daughters and granddaughters. She really fully embraced it this time. And I think a lot of people thought that was a huge mistake from the last campaign.
You also tell us that for somebody who'd been in public life for so many decades, she and her campaign team apparently had a great deal of difficulty really articulating in a nutshell what her candidacy was supposed to be all about. Why would they have had so much trouble trying to articulate that?
It's really interesting. She had essentially 8 years to figure out why she should be president, or why people should vote for her for president, why her and why now. And she never really addressed that issue. And that was something that was problematic for her from the very beginning. My co-author and I detail an inside account of what went on behind the scenes of her first speech. And it was kind of chaotic from the beginning. She invited all these advisors in to work on it, and speechwriters, and even one Obama speechwriter who was so exasperated at the end by the process that he just threw his hands up in the air and left before the speech was even done. Because I think he and a lot of other people were frustrated that it didn't really speak to her. There was no reason why people should vote for her this time. It was your typical Democratic stump speech.
No reason to vote for her other than to make history as the first female president, and obviously that just wasn't enough for a lot of people, right?
Right, exactly. And the most interesting part I think one of the most interesting parts of this election was the fact that millennial women didn't feel compelled to support her. They felt like they would see another woman run for president eventually in their lifetimes and didn't like her enough to support her, particularly on the heels of supporting someone like Bernie Sanders. They felt like, his message was really resonating with them and not hers.
One of the more interesting quotes you've got in the book is you're quoting one of her confidants saying that she really didn't want to run for president. And that just does not mesh with the conventional wisdom out there about Secretary Clinton, which is that she's this, ruthlessly ambitious person who'd drive over anybody in order to get this job. Whose version of the real Hillary do you believe on this one?
I think a little bit of both, which is interesting. I think she wanted to run for president. She feels like she is the right person with the right ideas. She's very policy driven. But I think 2008 really It took a hit. She took a hit there, and it took her a while to kind of rebound and realize what had happened. She didn't know if she wanted to put herself through that again. So there were people who know her very well who kind of agreed with that model and didn't think that she should do that and want to go through that again. And it's a really tiresome process. She had just had grandchildren. A lot of people thought that she should just do something different, but I think she felt compelled at the end of the day that she was the right person and that was the right person for the right time and had the right ideas to kind of take the country forward after 8 years of Barack Obama.
And yet there was a family friend that you quote in the book as having said to Secretary Clinton, "Everybody knows who you are, but no one knows who you are." And I wonder again, how can that be with somebody who's been in the public eye for so many decades?
It's a very strange thing because she is a public servant, and yet she wants to remain private. It's this constant push-pull of how much does she want to reveal of herself to the public. And I think that's one of the reasons, or one of the problems we saw this time, that she wanted a private email server because of that dynamic, that she doesn't want all her emails out there. She didn't want to be exposed in that way. And that came back to haunt her, and that was a huge problem for her in this campaign.
Well, let me ask about her judgment, and since you brought up the email server, I'll dovetail off of that, because she came in for big-time criticism on two things. The private email server was one of them, and then giving speeches to Wall Street firms that, where she charged more than $200,000 to make those speeches. She had to know that if she ever intended to run for president, those would be two things that could come back to bite her, and yet she did them anyway. Does anybody have any understanding of why she would do what seemed to be self-destructive things?
No, and that was a big question, and both loomed over her campaign throughout. The email controversy, for instance, she was having to go on defense a month before she even announced her candidacy. And this was a narrative that loomed over her campaign the entire time, and particularly in the first 6 months, where she is trying to push a message and an economic message, and she is being drowned out by this controversy. And there's a moment of frustration there that we talk about in the book, where she and her husband are on a call with a lot of aides, and they are frustrated, and they're asking their aides why they're not able to push an economic message. And essentially, they're told, well, the email controversy is drowning us out. And there was an internal debate over whether to get out in front of it. A lot of her aides felt like she and the president, or the former president, needed to talk about it. And she in particular needed to apologize for why she felt the need to have a private server. And I think, I think that was, it took her so long to kind of realize that it was a problem. And that narrative kind of was very problematic for her, and she never really recovered from it. And even when she apologized, it took her a couple of tries to actually come forward and give a good enough answer.
Amie, as you well know, the first big test of any presidential campaign happens in Iowa. The Iowa caucuses, which are almost a year before the actual election day. And of course, Hillary Clinton went into those Iowa caucuses with a 32-point lead on Bernie Sanders, her challenger for the Democratic presidential nomination. And on caucus night in Iowa, it ended up a tie. Can you take us behind the scenes and talk about what the aftermath of Iowa was like for those trying to figure out what the heck just happened?
Oh, it was a nail biter, and we take you behind the scenes of this night. You can't make this stuff up. There's a snowstorm coming. They need to get out of town before the snowstorm hits Iowa. Bill Clinton is sitting inside her hotel suite, is so impatient. He's sitting there with leather gloves and his suit, and they're trying to decide, or they're trying to figure out what's happening. They see that the matchup is very tight. The results are coming in, and she barely has the lead. And Bill Clinton is asking questions and trying to find out what's happening, and he's kind of playing political director at the time. And finally, things are so tight, but they feel like they've won. So there's a decision made to quickly get in the cars, go give a speech declaring victory, although she never says she won for certain. But they go out there and they do, and they get on a plane to New Hampshire, a state that she felt compelled to go to, even as her campaign manager was trying to steer her away. And she felt like she needed it for the general election. But I think that kind of set the course in the beginning of the campaign. And it was, if she obviously got trounced a state later in New Hampshire. If she would have lost in Nevada, it could have been a game changer then. Of course, she recovers. But in the aftermath of the first couple of states, she's kind of struggling to understand what is happening. She confides to one longtime advisor, I can't wrap my arms around what's going on. She kind of sees this rise of populism, sees the excitement behind Bernie Sanders, and can't really fully understand it. And I feel it's one of the most poignant moments of the book and kind of gives you an insight into where her head was at the time.
Well, here's a quote from the book that speaks just to that very point you've just made. Hillary couldn't grasp the sentiment of the electorate, the resentfulness white working and middle-class Americans felt watching the wealthy rebound quickly from the 2008 economic crisis while their family struggled through a slow recovery. Her team didn't really get it either. Simple question, Amie. Why not?
It's a question that still plagues the campaign, and I think there were people who were concerned from the get-go that she wasn't speaking to the base of people who supported her in 2008, the same people who supported her husband in his 92 and 96 campaigns, that they were kind of forgetting about them. They felt like if they could play to the people who supported President Obama, African Americans, Hispanics, if they could get those voters out, that they could kind of they could win the election. And what they did was they forgot about the white working class. And Bill Clinton is actually one of the few people who realizes at the time that things seem awry. And he is constantly kind of flagging it for the campaign staff. But they are relying on their models, on their data analytics models, and they're telling them something completely different than what Bill Clinton is reporting. But I think it's something that they regret now in retrospect.
Here's something else. Let's quote from the book again on the relationship between the ex-president, the would-be president, and the campaign team, because there was certainly a lot of, there was a lot of anger to go around looking all ways. It was a self-signed death warrant to raise a question about Hillary's competence, to her or anyone else, in loyalty-obsessed Clinton world. Most of the people around her were jockeying to get closer to her, not to make her wonder about their commitment. Concern about being cast out to the perimeter of Hillary's overlapping circles of influence far outweighed the itch to tell Hillary what she was doing wrong. Her advisors held their tongues. You know, in hindsight, this is an absolutely fatal flaw, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. And the fact that one of the biggest complaints I think that a lot of Democrats had, a lot of Clinton supporters had at the time, was that she didn't have a David Axelrod type, a strategist who knew her for a long time, who could kind of tell her what was what she needed to do better. She had John Podesta, who obviously she's known for a very long time, flying at like the 50,000-foot level as campaign chairman. And then she had Robby Mook, her campaign manager, kind of flying at 15,000 feet. But there was no one kind of in the middle who could really tell her exactly what was going on. And I think that was something that a lot of people found really confounding. And I think they still wonder about it.
Your book really does chronicle constant tension between Podesta and Mook, the campaign chair and the campaign manager. Over what kinds of things, for example?
Well, I think they're two different styles of people. I think they have two different styles, rather. I think that John Podesta is very bold and straightforward, and Robby, has a core group of people that he relies on. John Podesta felt like Robby had been withholding information, not being as candid with him as possible. In one meeting that we talk about in the book, they're out at a senior retreat last summer, and they essentially, John Podesta calls Robby Mook passive-aggressive. And I think Robby felt like John could be too much to handle as well, and kind of a bully. And so I think the two kind of never meshed well. And what happened was, while people thought two people were actually leading the campaign, there was a secret board of directors that was created called the Super Six, where 6 different people actually ran the campaign and were in charge of various aspects of it. And that had never really been revealed until this book.
Sounds like if 6 people are in charge, nobody's in charge. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think that they tried to fix things as best as possible. They tried to elevate some people. Jake Sullivan, a very talented aide, very policy-driven, who Hillary Clinton said would be president one day, is one of those members. And, you know, for whatever reason, the 6 people don't quite, you know, they don't, even though things are tweaked a little bit and fixed and this creation is created, they don't tap into what Hillary Clinton needs most. And, you know, they still continue to rely on the models and the data instead of, you know, mixing or combining the art and the science. They had just really relied on the science.
One of the high-ranking members of the team, Jennifer Palmieri, used to have this expression that comes up throughout the book, which is, we're not allowed to have nice things. She said that over and over again. What exactly did that mean?
Every time the campaign felt like they had regained their footing, something came and swiped them, and they were back to, you know, trying to explain away something, or something bad happened. One example of that, I think, is Hillary Clinton had a really successful October in 2015. She dominated the first debate against Bernie Sanders. Joe Biden didn't run. And I think she had a really great Benghazi hearing. They felt like that month was theirs, and that they had their, you know, they could actually win the primary. And what happened was they suddenly see Bernie Sanders at their backs going into the Iowa caucus, and they are bewildered by how that has happened. And Hillary Clinton that holiday season is lighting up Robby Mook's phone and trying to find out exactly what was happening. They're watching the polls tighten. And so I think that was one big example of, you know, as soon as they find their footing, as soon as good things are happening for them, something bad happens. And that continues to happen throughout the campaign, and obviously goes into the very end when, you know, it seems like she's winning, and then James Comey comes out and reopens an investigation into her emails. And I think that that kind of speaks to what that was about as well.
Well, it became clear after a while that she was going to beat Bernie Sanders, and she did, and she got the nomination. And then, of course, Donald Trump got the Republican nomination. And as it becomes, finally, a 2-person contest, at the end of the day, despite all of Secretary Clinton's faults, she surely demonstrated a more classically better temperament for the job of president. She clearly had more experience in politics than Donald Trump did. She beat Donald Trump in every single one of the leaders' debates in which they faced off one-on-one. There was the Access Hollywood tape that Donald Trump had to somehow overcome. You know, in spite of, yes, the deplorables comment, and in spite of the Comey investigation and the emails, and in spite of all of that stuff, apparently none of the good stuff for her mattered, and none of the bad stuff for him mattered. Are you yet clear in your own mind why that happened?
No, because I think the same people who voted for him when polling came out said, you know, that as she tried to disqualify him, they kind of bought into that, and yet they still found him fit to be president, which is kind of surprising. And yeah, you're right. I think that she dominated during the debates. She felt like, you know, the most prepared person in those debates would win. The one who was policy oriented, the one who could delve into policy minutia. But none of that mattered, as you said. And I think she's still trying to figure out what happened. And I think what ultimately happened, one of the reasons I think she lost, is because her base never really came home. Donald Trump's did. She couldn't convince the Bernie Sanders supporters who, were so excited about his candidacy to ultimately support her. And a lot of them stayed home. A lot of them just didn't like either candidate and didn't really feel compelled to vote for her. And this goes back to our initial, in Chapter 1, where we really talk about why she's running. A senior advisor told us, and this is after the campaign, I would have had a reason for running or I wouldn't have run. That kind of speaks to what happened and why she couldn't really persuade people and convince people to actually turn out for her.
You know, one of the presumably great speeches in American presidential history that we would have liked to have heard, just because I'm curious as to what she would have said, is the speech that Hillary Clinton would have given on election night after she broke the final highest glass ceiling. And of course, she never got to give that speech. Do you know what was in that speech?
We detail a little bit in the book, and she talks about, her mother keeps coming up in various speeches throughout the campaign, and she looks back at her mother's fight and everything that her mother had to go through to make this moment happen. And she kind of nods at that and says, my mother will have seen me become president. And I'm paraphrasing there, but I think that was the sentiment.
She did sort of give some of that speech, I mean, clearly, even though she lost, but at a speech that she gave after election night, right? She sort of trotted out some of those themes in that address. What was that about?
Exactly. I think that was seen as the speech she was going to give. They kind of pieced it together as much as they could and salvaged it and gave it to, I think it was the Children's Defense Fund, her first real speech after the election. And so they felt like it was so powerful and the message was so powerful that they wanted to kind of to still let it live in some capacity. And yeah, so she did, but she kept those words out of the speech, the ones I just talked about, because obviously it didn't happen. And yet, it was such a poignant thing. I think a lot of people, even Republicans who read the book, found themselves kind of rooting for her in that moment and kind of seeing the human qualities and the human side of her there. So I think it's a very poignant moment.
A couple of minutes to go, Amie, and I want to touch on two more quick things if I can. Number one, has she read the book? Do you know if she's read the book? If she has, does she have any thoughts on it that have got back to you?
We know a lot of people in her world have read the book. A lot of them have privately told us that we hit it on the mark. There was a public reaction to it from her world that said, kind of questioning the infighting that we talk about in the book. But, my co-author and I have always stood by our reporting and felt really good about it. And that was sort of why I think this book caught fire, because I think we did a unique thing in telling their story, the people inside the campaign, and what that campaign was really like. And so I think we're really proud of that effort.
And just finally, there are still, obviously, I mean, she got 3 million more votes than Donald Trump did, so there are clearly plenty of Americans who still have high hopes for her and hope that she has not run her last campaign. There were lots of rumors out that she might even try to run for mayor of New York City. Do you have any inside knowledge about whether or not Secretary Clinton is, in fact, done with elective politics?
I think she's done. We say as much in the book. She says as much in the book. We, on election night, have a scene where a lot of her aides want her to kind of hit Donald Trump very hard in her concession speech. And she kind of takes a step back and says that's someone else's problem. This was my last race. I'm going to leave that to others to make that case. I don't think she wants to put herself through this again. As we talked about before, she needed a little convincing to do this a second time. I think what she does want to do is be part of the resistance, and she's making that clear. She, in recent weeks, has been out there trying to talk about what's happening. And I think there's obviously a place for her to do that. I think a lot of people are kind of done with her over-explaining what happened in the campaign and want to hear her talk about how she's responsible, which is why we detail a lot of what we detail in the book. But I think, I think a lot of Democrats still feel like there is, they want to hear from her, and they want her to kind of help lead the party out of this tumultuous time for a lot of people. And I think she'll continue to do that.
Well, you hit it out of the park again, I got to tell you. Shattered Inside Hillary Clinton's Doom Campaign was just a terrific read. You and your co-author, Jonathan Allen, give yourselves a good pat on the back, because that's a tremendous read on what happened inside that Doom campaign. Amie Parnes, good of you to join us on the line from Washington, D.C. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.